would just read a couple of passages from Cooling Time, hopefully passages that will generate a conversation, which is, especially given this particular audience, I would very much like to have a conversation. And the first one is a little piece on complexity called Concerning Complexity. This is essentially all in one sentence, but I don't know if I can read it that way. I submit, the more our lives are governed by the great mixmaster of egotistic, material, and technostructural forces, the more distorted the whole business of living and creating becomes. To be undone by a work of art nowadays, I seek a transient clearing in which I am compelled to rely on next to no references. I have to find it on my own, and I may or may not choose to share it. So fearful I am of someone trying to stuff my wee opening with pre-frozen servings of praise and censure. I am still wanting to get my eyes peeled by what they alone are seeing, and my hair pulled by what its individual roots are feeling, and my mind bent by the weirdness of its wiring. And I am at the exact same location with regard to making anything resembling art, subordinating itself to the nomenclature of poetry. Anyone calling oneself called to write poems amid all the earth noise we're putting out there. My relationship to art changes, and I would not have it fixed. For example, I recall I didn't like Mr. Donald Judd's work until about 10 years ago. Then I started finding when I was in a big name-brand museum, my entire anticipation was built around getting to those boxes. They just seemed to be enough. I saw them as whole, selfless, and quite useless except to behold. That is all, and that equals an eyeful. And I could name a few living poets who currently strike that tone with me, but I won't, not right now, as I'm feeling protective of and protected in their spaciousness. And that is a space I aspire to occupy, that whatever space I might come to take up in my own book of books should have a singing inside. It is not that complexity is overrated, but it is overcomplicated. It is not that obscurity is too obscure, it's that the underside grows grungy if it isn't exposed to a change of air. It is not that the language is exhausted, it is that we run down. It is not that the edge won't cut anymore, it is that the cuts are getting thinner. It's not that art is artificial, it is that the artists get outright sedity. It's not that literary reputations are not inevitable, it's that they are invented. Not that theories are not beautiful, but that they are feeble. Although we have opposable heads, the legions of poets composing our blue sheets will have to orchestrate the lucid intervals and be prepared to fill them with eye-peeling, hair-pulling, mind-bending language. And don't even get me started on form. But if I were an engineer, I am sure I would want to have built the Brooklyn Bridge, even if it half paralyzed me as it did the builder. The mere mention of which sends me to Rockbridge County, where there's a photographer who sees the cleavage in the ground. She sees the writing in the trees, she sees the light in the black water, the trunk leaking, the columns disappearing. Down the road in Monroe, there is another who can throw her black drop up over the door to the death chamber and render the map in the back roads of a face nail bright. There's a poet in the desert who tweezes the glittering particulars of the species from mounds of dead cells and arranges them along the hairline fractures of our souls, if there are such eminences. In Montreal, there's a long, tall poet who quit her job at the train lines to receive the calibration of air in the immense hall of the station. Then there are the stalwart Waldrops. There is never enough time to sort it all out, so some of us get laggard. Just at the rarest opportunity to shift deeper into the somewhat miraculous, we hit the wrong answer button. We turn our slender chances into drool. Just when we thought we were being conducted to a single point for a specifically set-aside purpose. It is not so complicated, but it is never so simple either. I like to come and go through different doors more than I like to throw my weight against the same one every time, only to discover it was hollow as Hollywood or never even locked. And I like to change the locks once in a while too. But it isn't just about keeping it interesting for author, or dear reader. It is about how differently things actually play out if you come and go by different portals. Long live la différence. As for transcendence, well, baby, that is the sun's job. So that's a little piece on complexity. And these are mostly written in sort of discrete paragraphs, and in some instances the paragraphs are, have a linking thought. These passages seem to be primarily about audience. It is all too fair to assume most of us are poets, or we wouldn't be reading this, not when we could be watching the Redskins, or be down in the den cleaning the guns, or communicating something tangibly effective that we could either sell or otherwise have the opportunity to make available to crowds such as porn stars and evangelists routinely reach. I think it must stay open all night in beautiful cellars, Merton insisted, and so do I, and why doesn't it? And where and when and how does our awareness of its shrunken territory, that of the specialized cult, abjure further separation and negation and seek to reverse directions? What is troublesome about poets sequestered at the university is that unless we go to trade school or are exempt as trust fund cases, in the sight of potential employers, we might as well bear the mark of the beast. As a result, the university is virtually the only place for us. In the nation at large, being a poet is suspect at best. Read? I don't read. Reading's for queers, said one respondent to a recent poll on literacy. What a country. I am among many of the hard-pressed to accept the fixed-foot, flat-earth survivalist school of poetry calling itself New Formalism as being new, much less formally interesting. By the same reading, only by lack of scrutiny and challenge could free verse poets call verse free. That was not related to this subject. It had been my own aspiration when I first undertook to write poetry, to read and make poetry, that it would bring people together. My aspirations are still pitched high, though my expectations of it being either a source or beneficiary of this virtuous byproduct have subsided. At times I am half persuaded the reasons for exhaustively articulated divisions among contemporary American poets are real. At other times I think they are fundamentally French. For the most part, I suspect the skirmishes are pertinent to clarification and yet more relational to our removal from the public sphere, the near total disenfranchisement of the American intellectual, eventually leading to the proverbial infighting that throttles any worthwhile effort. Pure poetry, non-stop. It is wearing. I get so tired of the sect of poetry. I want my writing to be exploratory and animate and profound. I want to touch my blameless dreams, even if to date it is all paper and mistakes. Can anyone get their writing unadulterated poetry? Ask informally, what is a young poet to do? Robert Creeley proposed, form a company. He meant start an e-zine or a press, publish yourselves. One press flies by the Ethernet, start another by prosaic day. Form a company in the repertory theater's sense of the world ensemble. Let each do their part. Each has his or her place in the procession, just as Walt said. Another strategy is to create new structures that further the art for its own sake, create a language the unborn might be unashamed to speak. Poets should exceed themselves. When demands on us are slack, we should be anything but. Pressing the demands of the word forward is not only relevant but urgent. If our country does not vigorously cultivate poetry, it is either poetry's ineluctable time to wither, or time to make a promise on its own behalf to put out new shoots and insist on a much bigger pot. I think I would have to, I didn't mark enough passages to extend this, though there are more that sort of, it seems to be one of my preoccupations is audiences, that who are we speaking to, you know, and if we're not speaking to anyone but ourselves, is that enough? Is that good enough? Yeah.
I wanted to take up the topic of complexity first.
Okay.
Because you have a couple of other. Yeah, here's a sentence of yours. I am concerned with density, setting up a chain reaction using the least amount of verbal material. And I guess what I want to ask you about is simplicity, and about the impulse to condense can be, say, in classical poetry, this is a simplification process of concentration. It can also be a source of obscurity. And I wanted to draw you out on the attractions of simplicity, because in some of the poems, and in one I especially like, which I'd like to read, from the sequence that you read from last night, I think that there is a realization of simplicity that I think could be called classical and makes sense in speaking of as appealing to a classical taste in poetry, and also being close to the modernist impulses of condensation. And it's just four lines. Linked to an experience, a feeling deep down that won't stop twisting until the last rivet of grief is secure. All our days are numbered, not unlike old lumber for a house that's going to be moved and lived in all over again. Same old blunders on a different hill. So thinking about that, and, you know, that's not only a critique of too much of poets who are enamored of complexity, but it's a realization of art in simplicity. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the attractions of that kind of lean style.
I think I can. Well, I am. The statement about density is true. That I can be very prolix, or I can be fairly spare in the writing. I feel like I've really gotten closer to sort of the gesture of song when it's spare, and that it, you know, when it gets too when there's too much language at it, I feel I'm losing the music of the language. But I feel like I do it when I need to convey more information. And I feel like poetry can carry information. And I'm not, I mean, there are poets who are resolutely difficult to access. Some of them are by principle of, you know, an organization of tenets almost, such as maybe some of the language poets, not all of them. And some are just by the very nature of the way their own brain cracks, such as Meme Bersenbrugge. And I really admire this work, you know, and not everybody's work that is difficult to access, but I do admire that. I just have a resistance to it as an end, you know, as actually a poetic value. But I feel like people are doing things in order to because they feel the language has been so emptied out that they are trying to reinvent it on new terms, along a new ground of syntax and significance. And getting it is not the point per se. Reinventing it is the point. But I think that a lot of the luster of the language is in the simple, which doesn't necessarily mean the self-evident or the literal. It's more, I think, akin to kind of being clean. Sort of, I think of Oppen, who can be obscure, but obscurity would not be the point for Oppen. It's just because he works along sort of the oblique.
Well, Oppen is an interesting example.
Right.
Because he was completely severed from academic culture. Didn't work in a university, didn't really hang out with professors, didn't read literary theory. And so whatever obscurity he had, it didn't come from that.
That's right.
That professional
That's right.
discourse, and that's quite different from the obscurity of the language writers. And
well, except that Oppen was part of a coterie, self-designated group of poets with certain who made certain claims about language. All urban intellectuals.
Yeah. Well, I think his poetry is obscure by condensation and by severe brevity when it's obscure, but not by trying to carry too much information or absorbing other discourses.
Right.
So when you speak about poetry being a fit instrument for conveying information, what kinds of information do you think are appropriately conveyed or taken up by poetry? Is it the information about the language, how the language is spoken by people who don't normally speak in poems? Or?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, is a kind of reflexivity. And, is its own discussion of its own business. And I think part of it is also that I think the genres are breaking down. I think they've always been breaking down and reconstituting themselves. But when you think of a writer like Sebald, that what he, in spite of being considered by the Germans until after his death, perhaps, being a sort of stodgy, classical kind of writer, he sort of broke open the form, of fiction, and the language is, very elevated and very stern. And by putting the photographs in, he sort of changed, the view of what a fiction is and what a document is, what a history is. And so that was also a model, a distant model for me for a project such as One Big Self, was that the document also has an imaginary space, that it's not, that the sympathetic imagination can be engaged with the document just as much as it can if you're trying to write a lyric.
Well, I asked you about omitting the crimes in that piece of information. You don't include, though, that this is that after, with the photographs of the convicts, there's date of birth is given and the sentence is given, and there's other information too. Can you remind me?
Well, Debbie developed what information she wanted, which she scratched on the back of each of the tintypes. I'll call them tintypes, though they're not. And she had started by going to Angola and had failed to, at that point, to sort of codify what she wanted to know. Then when she started going to St. Gabriel, the women's prison, she decided that she wanted to ask them, for instance, how many children they had and where they were from. And I think that that information may not be among the inmates at Angola. I think it's date of birth, the length of their sentence, maybe their work at the prison. I don't know if it tells where they were from. And it doesn't ask about the children, but it was because just the chronology at which she started going to the prisons that she thought, oh, she would like to ask that. I mean, you would meet women who had 19 children, you know.
But did she ever
significant.
Did she ever ask the men about the children?
No, because she didn't want to change the form after she had started it, so she left it. Left it without that.
I mean, that's another example, another case. I mean, the question, we should probably repeat the exchange we had about what does it mean, I asked you, that the crimes for which the convicts are convicted, that information is omitted. And that information is, of course, the sort of mainstream, normal curiosity. One wants to know
right.
What did this person do that brought them into prison and then into this book, and that hunger for information is not satisfied.
That's right, and you do have it. I mean, we do have it. You know, there's a little bit of an ambulance chaser maybe in all of us, or something that. It felt that in order for the inmates to be comfortable talking to us and us comfortable talking to them, we would not bring that. They were doing the time for the crime, and that what we wanted to get at was our common ground, was our, whole selves. Just that these were. These men had been somebody's little babies, and there was a moment when they had a lot of promise, maybe it was 5 seconds, there were things, they had dreams, so we wanted to engage that kind of. I don't think many people would come and say, is there any kind of food you don't like, or what's your favorite color, or did you ever have any animals, or did you, what's a strong memory you have of your childhood, a strong good, So it was, I think it was a richer experience for all of us, that we didn't treat them with respect to their crime. At one point we did, there was a man that we did that. We thought this man was the Buddha. He was just the most gentle, so very touching person. And he was the warden's fisherman. There are 2 lakes at Angola. And he was like almost like a naturalist, to talk to him about the life, the living life, the things, the animals, and the vegetation and everything at Angola. But then we were having dinner with some of the officers later at a nearby catfish place or something, and we brought up this man, and this correction officer told us what he had done, and I said, let's just don't ever ask that question again. Just to, because it was then it was very uncomfortable. I mean, it was.
Doesn't that suggest that the use of information in poetry is severely constrained to the instrument? Namely, we deal in affection and sympathy. We don't deal in judgment and shame.
Well, there are some rather graphic pieces in the book. They're just not attached to any particular individual, that indicate that this is not I was not interested in idealization, and that no one was there for spitting on the grass, or spitting on the sidewalk, walking on the grass, or whatever, And so there are some very disturbing elements in the text. I just didn't want to ascribe them to a particular individual.
Can you talk a little bit about, seems like another reason not to say what they did is sort of the power of silence. And when that's unspoken, and you spoke a little bit about this, I think, early in what you were reading, when you said that you wanted to stay in a space and you could only preserve the singing of the space if you didn't sort of maybe reveal the name of the song or the name of what you were singing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that's also maybe part of the strategy of that project, is to not say what they did, because it preserves this weird silence over these people and gives you information about them, withholds information that you would think is the first, most important information about what they did.
Mm-hmm.
Wearing rabbit costumes, and you don't know what they did, and so it sort of dwells on the yang and leaves the yin completely unsaid and acts like it isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, well, why did Gregor turn into a bug? And I wonder if you thought about that, or if how conscious you were of that in the project, or just because it seems like once you become conscious of that as a strategy, then you've sort of spoiled, then you've already set it in your mind, and how you juggle consciousness about silence and that makes any sense.
I don't think I thought about that as a strategy in writing it. I think that it's kind of, I've cultivated a sense of leaving things out that were not especially related to the fact that I didn't want to tell what their crimes were, or didn't want to ask them what their crimes were. That was that was for a different reason, really. That was to not cut into their humanity, or our perception of their humanity, I think, or my own, or to color my own, or to have them shut down on me because I had, invaded this issue, So, but as as a writing practice, I have I've come to value that white space, that ellipsis, and that attention to the caesura and everything that can, I think the silence is very freighted in almost any text, and I feel like I've learned a little bit, just craft-wise, about how to manipulate that.
The book is extraordinary. It does really give one surprises, but the whole costuming thing is not what one would expect from a book like that.
Right.
So that there's a kind of frustration of part of what one wants to know there, and there is also a sort of some access to information about the subjects of the photographs. That's also not what you would expect.
I think it does say a little, I think it does identify whether it was Mardi Gras or Halloween, the people in costumes. And, this is Louisiana, this is a Catholic state, these are high holy days, Mardi Gras and Halloween. It's not celebrated at the men's prison, but at the women's prison they go all out. It was quite remarkable. You'll see in the book there are older women who are dressed in what looks to be sort of almost like bridal finery or something, and it's as if they were like the empresses of some lost country. And the younger women, inmates, had determined that they would make the older women the queens of their Mardi Gras, so that's why they were dressed that way. And then there are a few women who are dressed in great big stripes. Debbie, who was the photographer, didn't want a lot of prison paraphernalia in the images, which was again part of the same concern. We're just going to see them, and this is their opportunity to look out in a way and present themselves as they want to be presented. They posed themselves, they brought their own props, etc. They decided when they wanted to be, in costume, and or whether they wanted to be photographed in costume. But the large stripes, the women who are in maximum security, if they work in the fields, they wear the large stripes. Just, like in a cartoon, great, big, giant black and white stripes. And they were not allowed to participate in Mardi Gras. So the women who were, in honor of them, created these almost like Dr. Seuss hats out of these black and white striped uniforms, and their own costumes were, and it was supposed to be a tribute to the women in lockdown. It's very nice. There's a lot of humor too, and part of that is almost the culture of the South. It's a kind of ribald locus.
I was curious if you see the subjects of the book as an audience for it, or not at all.
We certainly made copies available, and Debbie returned prints to everyone she photographed. A shot of every pose she took of them. So they were, personal audience, but we also, all the prison libraries got copies.
Did you ever hear any responses about
recently, Debbie heard from someone who had gotten out, and the woman identified her photograph, and she did like it. And we heard from a number of people when we would go back after they had gotten their prints back too. One woman, the woman I mentioned earlier, who had 19 children, and she was an older woman, and when she said she had 19 children, Debbie and I just sort of looked at her, and she said, "I didn't kill anybody." I said, "Oh, all right." And she said that none of her children had visited her since she'd been in prison. Well, that's hard. That's very hard. And so she wanted to be photographed because she was hoping that it would soften her children to her. And 7 of them came to visit after they got her picture. It's like, oh yeah, Ma. No, but it brought her back to them as a person, So that was worth the whole shebang there. Can't beat that.
If I could just build from that question, speaking of the convicts as readers, audience in the new book, I think that unlike, say, Deep Stuff Comes Shining, in which there's a narrative and it's followable, but it takes considerably more time, and at least from my experience, to get closer to knowing more about the book, and I'm still it's more of a puzzle. Whereas this book, once you know what its sociological frame is and its kind of general approach, I had never read it before and just heard you yesterday and followed quite clearly. And then there's also just the general curiosity, be it ambulance case or not, of prison life that exists in the world. And also even W. Lester's photographs I found more, I shouldn't comment on photography very much, but they're more straightforward than, say, some of the other work she's done with you.
Right.
So putting all that together would seem that the book would have a chance for new audiences. Could one hope that those curious about prison, although they might not get the information they might have been originally seeking, would then be brought in?
I think it does, but there's a big barrier there in that it's $60. It's published by a photographic press, which is why the images look as good as they do. They've gone through 4 color separations. They've been spot varnished, and so that's a little hard.
For wealthy new readers,
right? Wealthy, new affluent readership. But I think that of people who pick it up who might have never thought they were interested in prisoners might get a little more interested, when they really see people as people. I think the pictures are very intimate, and I think that was the goal too, that each person was who they were. But that's another thing about audiences. If you work with a photographer, you're talking about high-end books, and I don't know how to resolve that. If Copper Canyon had produced the book, it would have been a mess. I mean, they've done beautiful books for me, but they don't have the resources to do photographs, and or the design capacity, or the paper stock, or it's so. And this publisher is a total maverick, but he doesn't do paperbacks, which would have been another way to make it create a slightly different audience.
Just after perusing for a while through your book, I noticed that there are several contradictory gestures of concealment as far as your models are concerned. Some of them have their faces covered. On the other hand, we have most of them exposing their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And also in your text and in the information that you provide, although you do not tell the reader what was the crime that they committed, so this is also an act of a certain concealment. And on the other hand, I think it's somehow in your text, it's reflected in, I think, at least several times repeated the phrase "don't ask, don't ask,
Mm-hmm.
don't ask." It's here and there.
Mm-hmm.
So, to what extent you wanted to avoid a confessional mode of exposure
Mm-hmm.
of a certain frame of
There was so much you could convey without, totally autobiographical, statements. I mean, I didn't want it to degenerate into prose. The issues I felt came through very strongly. One is about the length of terms, the rate, and the other is about the rate of incarceration. And the other is the isolation. I mean, it's so far beyond everyone's own existential, procession toward the death. It's so hard to imagine without putting some images out there that give you a sense of just how extreme this isolation can be. And then at the same time, I wanted to vivify it so that people could understand that this is a shadow world, that these people have hospice organization, they have Rotary, they can get a BA in divinity, they have about 67 clubs, most of which are sort of positive thinking kinds of clubs, Toastmasters, they have 12-step programs, Cowboys for Jesus, and they have all kinds of sports. So I did want to make that evident too, that people are even under such conditions are creating lives, and are even trying to improve themselves, under conditions which you could call hopeless in a way. I mean, 87% of the inmates at Angola never leave, and some of them went in at 17. That's hard time.
So many of your prisoners seem to identify themselves through various markers on the body, on their faces and bodies. And I wanted to ask you to what extent the photographer wanted to emphasize that sort of self-identification, which of course, which implies that this is a world of transgression. These people are.
I think it's well. There's tattoo art is huge in prison, and now it's very fashionable in the free world, and we can probably thank the prisoners for that. I mean, it's. I think if one interpretation of it could fairly be that this is the only thing they own. This is the only thing they can do what they will with, is their body. And so it is a kind of text, you know. It is a place, it is their canvas for expression. And some of the tattoos are crude because of the way they're done, because it's not like they're permitted, but they're tolerated. So, you know, they have all these icky ways of tattooing one another. And also sometimes people, they outgrow the tattoo. I mean, the tattoo may have been just absolutely vicious, you know. They outgrow it, and they want to get rid of it. Well, they're not going to bring in a cosmetic surgeon to remove an unwanted tattoo on a maximum security inmate. So they create a whole other tattoo over it until it just becomes a real mess, but it's no longer legible with the message that it once conveyed. But you'll see one inmate in here who's got a tattoo of circles that go around his eye. Then he's got his lip pulled down. It says, "Fuck you." It's just, he had it all over him, you know, and we were like, so, do you think the police wouldn't notice you? You know, it's like, I bet, you know, they were really happy to see, you know, just no sense, you know. Some people just do not know that they're really just about asking for it. But and some of the tattoos were very offensive, you know. Just it was, I don't know, it's who they were. They were not allowed to do this at the maximum security prison. It was only at the minimum security prison that they took off their shirts. Of course, it was also 110 degrees, you know, and so they were, and there were no resources at all at the minimum security prison. It has since closed, so there was just the iron pile, and you know, tattoo art. So either they were working out on weights, or they were braiding each other's hair, or they were tattooing one another. You know.
So there's more culture in the sense of institutional culture in the maximum security prison than in the minimum security prison.
Mm-hmm.
I see.
Because it is an institution, and the minimum security prison is a transient place. You know, they're not there that long. If they're going to do longer time, then they're moved to another unit.
Well, I was struck. I have a friend who's in prison in California who I visit, and in a state prison, and that culture is a much leaner affair than what you're representing here. And I wonder if that is a regional leaner culture.
There's less.
That is, there's no Toastmasters in this prison. And there are meetings if you're a Muslim, there are meetings for worship. There are Christian meetings of worship, and there's AA. That's pretty much it. And with regard to organizations, and this is an antiseptic sort of, 1940s construction prison outside of about 40, 50 miles outside of Los Angeles, and no hardback covers, no hardback books can be mailed into the prison, only paperbacks, and they can only be mailed directly by the publisher. You can't mail somebody a book, and there are no courses taught in the prison.
Mm-hmm.
The days of the poets in the prison in California are gone.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, there may be some federal prisons in California where that's permitted, but that whole sense of things is not operating there. That the privileges extended to prisoners are now far fewer than they were 20 years ago in California.
It's legislature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the hatred of prisoners is very great. And in the Schwarzenegger election, as some of you probably know, one of the big issues was how much the prison guards are paid, namely that they're overpaid, and that Gray Davis was the charge from the right from Schwarzenegger's camp was that Gray Davis had negotiated giving far too much to the prison guards union, and that it was too cushy a job. And essentially that means cutting back on financial support for the prison, so that I think the reaction as the prison population has gone up, the reaction in some parts of the country is to, make the time harder.
Well, the privatization has also done that, probably even more aggressively than the legislatures, I think.
I had a question that came to mind when you were responding, describing some of the tattoos and so forth. And it's a question that has to do with obviousness and evidence and the poet's responsibility to his or her material. And I also wanted to think about, there's the term that two poets I can think of use, investigative poetics. Ed Sanders talks about this and does very discursive, prolix, information-laden poems. The history of the 20th century in the U.S., a book called 1968. And then there's another poet, and that's Joan Retallack, who writes a very different kind of poetry.
She uses that term also.
She uses this term as well, and is writing poetry, as you probably know, that's much more on the Gertrude Stein / John Cage end of the dial. Which is to say, she's not doing investigative journalism in the way that somebody like Ed Sanders can present himself. And I want to maybe draw you out, thinking from the statement, some of the statements you began with about complexity and so forth, and just to see what you can say about your responsibility to, how your sense of responsibility to the material that you're working on, when it's been clearly representative, and where you're using quotes from prisoners and your poetry comes accompanied with portraits, in contrast to your earlier work, Deep Steps and Come Shining, for instance. So, material like that.
Well, when you're directly engaging people, a living population in the text, then it's a very different responsibility than with something like Deep Step Come Shining. The premise of that was dreams of the blind, about which I know nothing. Obviously, nothing, So that meant I made it up. I read a lot of things about vision, but I was interested not just in corporeal vision, but vision, other kinds of vision. And in order to write that book, I took a trip again with Debbie Lester, visiting outsider artists. That was how I informed it. So that's different. It's very different responsibility than when you're working, when you have I have often worked with a subject. That's for some writers and some poets, I think a subject would be anathema to them. I find that if I have a subject, I can go anywhere. That's just sort of like home plate, and then I can go anywhere with that. But because I was working with a living population, I did feel the onus of getting it right in a different kind of way, in an ethical way, rather than in an imaginative way. It was taxing. And I thought that even the worst thing I could really do was an idealization, of the inmates or of the institution. That was what I felt like could be my biggest error.